Welcome back to the Ultimate Mixdown. One of the things that really slowed me down when I started working with the MIDI editor was having to create individual notes, dragging them across the MIDI editor, and adjusting the lengths, and having all of these issues where things didn't line up correctly. So in this video, I want to give you 10 tips that help you speed up your workflow lightning fast so that you can focus on your melodies, you can focus on your chords, you can focus on your drums, and just work with the music and create those songs faster. Let's get right into the video. Welcome back to the Ultimate Mixdown, everyone. We have an exciting video today because we're going to talk about all things MIDI, especially with the MIDI editor. Now, if you're new to music production, you're new to virtual instruments, or you're new to the MIDI editor or MIDI in general, this is the video for you. We have a lot of topics to cover, so I'm not going to waste any time. We're going to jump right into it. The first thing I want to talk about, though, is what is MIDI? So MIDI is the data for the triggers and the releases of notes from a specific sound source, such as a virtual instrument. Now, today we have instrument tracks in many DAWs. Reaper's a special case, and I'll get into that in a minute. But today we have instrument tracks, so you could just load up an instrument track, you can select your virtual instrument, and you can start recording your MIDI, and it's going to play through the virtual instrument seamlessly, and you're all good to go. But back about 10, 15, 20 years ago, you actually had to create a MIDI track that recorded the MIDI data, which had no sound to it, and then route that to an aux track that actually had the virtual instrument on it, where the MIDI track would feed into the aux track to play the sound from the virtual instrument. And MIDI was actually initially used for outboard gear, such as an external keyboard, like a physical keyboard in front of you, where it had its own sound banks and patches that you wanted to bring into your DAW. And instead of recording it as audio, you could record it as this MIDI format where you could edit the notes, extend the length of the notes, move the notes around, and it'd be much easier to move those things around, less CPU intensive in many cases to do that. But today, a lot of people work in the box, a lot of people work with virtual instruments, and they use MIDI for those purposes. So the first thing I want to do to get into this is show you how to set this up. Now, if you know how to create a track, you know how to add effects, you know how to do certain types of inputs and routing, then skip ahead to the next section. But for anybody that's new, to create a new track, you actually go to the track control panel on the left here and just double click, or you could go to track, insert new track. I'm just going to double click. Now in Reaper, you can create a new track for basically anything. You could have this be an audio track, this could be a MIDI track, etc. It doesn't matter what it is. You don't have to worry about any special routing. You can just go ahead and use the track. So I'm going to call this piano because that's what we're going to use as our virtual instrument. It's automatically created with record arm, which is good because if we do any type of recording, it'll get captured because this is record armed. If you don't have this checked and you start the recording and you start playing notes on a keyboard, for example, you're not going to get any of your playing recorded into the DAW. So just keep that on for now. Now for inserts, we want to add some type of virtual instrument. As I mentioned, this is a piano track, so I'll just grab a piano instrument that I installed on my machine. Okay. So we have a piano instrument and we can hear it playing. Now I have my keyboard in front of me, so I'm going to do my input as my MIDI Korg R3, and I should be able to trigger the sounds of the piano, the virtual instrument, from this keyboard. Now if you're using a different DAW like Pro Tools or most other DAWs, you can use an instrument track to do the exact same thing. So you create an instrument track, you load up your virtual instrument on one of the inserts, and then you go and select the input again as your MIDI keyboard. Now, if you don't have an external device like a MIDI keyboard or some type of MPC pad or something like that, it's okay. You can draw the notes in manually, and I'm sure you've seen this if you watch other producers work. They can draw in melodies or chord progressions manually in the MIDI editor, and we'll get into that. So once you have these types of things set up, then you can go ahead and start playing around with MIDI. Now, for those of us that have external gear that we can record into this, you can just go and hit the record button and start playing and record that information down, and it's going to create a MIDI file. For those of us that don't have that type of external hardware, we're just going to select a region, and it's okay to just click the first bar or the first few bars, and you can go and do insert new MIDI item. Okay, and there's a key command here, and key commands are super important. We'll talk about that later too. So once you create a new MIDI item, it actually gives you this blank MIDI item that you can draw. It's kind of like your canvas for painting the MIDI notes within. Now to open up any MIDI item, whether it's existing or new, you double click. And because I clicked the new one, there's obviously no notes here. But this is essentially what you're going to see in any DAW. You'll see something like a piano roll. You'll see the piano on the left, right? And it'll have some of the notes named, and you can play around with the settings. You could have all the notes named. If you're using a sampler, you can actually have a way to make the samples display as the note names for the keys. So it's pretty useful to have these named. It's also good to just see where C is. So you don't have to just check on the piano. You don't have to turn your head sideways and see what you're looking at. Now we have this MIDI editor in front of us, and there's a few things that I want to note before we even start creating notes. The first thing is the grid down here. So the grid you set, basically if you want a straight pattern or if you want triplets or dotted or swing, and if you're relatively new to music theory, this is not a music theory video. So if you don't know what these mean, just keep it on straight for now. And then for grid, you want to set this, and basically 1/16 is 16th notes, 1/8 is 8th notes, and that will basically give you a grid line for every note that you've selected. So if we just do 1, that's a whole note, right? So this is from 1 to 2, just one note, 1 to 2. That's a whole note. You have 1 to 2, you have 2 to 3, and so forth. And if you want to use a quarter note, that would be a quarter of a whole note. So you have 1 quarter, 2 quarter, 3 quarter, 4 quarter. That's the extent that I'm going to get into with the grid. I find that a lot of music that I work with is between 8th notes and 16th notes. So I'm going to work with that. And then a few things up here to note for the menus. Snap grid, show grid, sorry. We'll select this one. This will show those grid lines. It's extremely useful to have them, so I'd keep that on at all times. And then this is the snap to grid. So if you have this selected, then whatever notes you create, they get snapped to this grid. So they start at any one of these given lines. They won't be falling in between the lines or out of time with your song. Now, if you deselect that, you can create a note anywhere within any of the regions or any of the frames that you see in the screen, and it won't necessarily be in time with your song. But this can also be useful because music isn't always 100% to the grid. Okay, but for many beginners, it's a great idea to have snap to grid on, and I believe that's selected by default, but if you don't know that, then just make sure you have that on. All right, now the next thing I want to talk about before we get into creating the notes are two extremely useful menus in Reaper. So that's the mouse modifiers, which is Command comma or Control comma, and then you go down to editing behavior, mouse modifiers. Now this is useful because not only do you see what the different modifiers such as Shift, Command, Control, Option, Alt, those types of things are considered modifiers, where if you hold those down while you're clicking, dragging, double clicking with your mouse, it'll modify the behavior in such a way that you can use additional functionality with your mouse. Now it's useful because not only can you see what those modifiers do to enhance the functionality of the mouse, but you can also change these by just double clicking and then selecting some other type of functionality. And that's the beauty of Reaper with all of its customizations. You can take any of these mouse modifiers and select some type of functionality that you think is more purposeful than what was the default. But I implore you to try the defaults first because oftentimes they are what you need or even more than what you need. Now the other menu I want to talk about is the actions list. So that's question mark on your keyboard or Shift/. Now this is all the actions that you can conduct with any type of key on your keyboard. You can find a shortcut so you can see what did I map to a specific key. So if I look for S, right, it tells me that I mapped S to this action, which is splitting the items at time selection. So that's good to know. So if I hit S on the keyboard, I can split something where I selected in the timeline. To search for a specific action, you can look at the filter, and let's say we want to insert a new MIDI item. For example, we inserted a new MIDI item when we created our track. So this is Option Shift M. So I could add a new key command here. I could say, okay, I want to use the letter A to do that. Now, if it's already used and you click OK, you're going to get an error message that says it's used elsewhere. Are you sure you want to override it? If it's not used, then just go ahead and accept it. And anytime you press A, it's going to insert a new MIDI item where you select in the arrange view. There's also ways to modify existing ones like we just talked about, and you can create new ones. So all of these actions that don't have any kind of key commands, If we need to use those, we find that we're using those often, then we want to create a shortcut. We want to use a key command for it. We don't want to keep going to this action menu or searching for it in the menu somewhere else. So keep those in mind, because when we start talking about adding notes, editing notes, moving notes, all those good things with the MIDI editor, I'm going to be talking a lot about mouse modifiers and key commands, especially the ones that I use. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of those menus. Now, the first thing that you want to do once you have an editor open is you want to start creating your song. You want to start adding notes. You want to create chords. You want to create melodies. Again, I'm not going into deep music theory or anything, but one of the most basic chord structures that you can use is a triad. That'd be the first or the root of the scale, the third and the fifth. So if I'm using, say, a C chord, then the root would be C, the third would be E, and the fifth would be G. In Reaper, to add a note, you just click and it'll add it. So we'll just click and add it. So you click and drag a little bit, right? You can drag a little bit farther if you want to extend that note beyond whatever you have the grid set. So I have the grid set to eighth notes right now, so it's only going to create an eighth note unless I drag it out further. So let's see, we have 1, E, G. So if I play that, all right, let's select these real quick and move them up so we can hear them better. Okay, so that's a very simple C triad. And this is how you would build out chords for an entire song. Now, a few things that I want to talk about with adding notes is I like to select my notes with the left click. I know it's not that big of a deal, but the default is using right click to get this marquee tool. So if you had notes elsewhere, like down here, you could select all these notes together by right clicking and dragging over them. But I like to use left click, so we're going to go right into the mouse modifiers. And we're going to go into MIDI piano roll, left drag. And the default, instead of it being insert note, because I'm going to insert note a different way, I'm going to double click. And I'm going to go to marquee selected notes, ignoring snap. So I'm just going to select the notes, whatever notes that I marquee over with my left drag, it's going to select. Okay, it's not going to worry about whether I got the whole note or not. I can just get a little piece of the note at the end and it'll still select that entire note so that I can move things around easily. That's useful to me. And then for creating notes, you can also create notes by double clicking. Okay, and then you can adjust that just by clicking and dragging the edge of that note. You can make it longer, you can make it shorter. So I can have it be the 1/8 that I set the grid to, or I can have it be a quarter note, or a half note, or a whole note. And then there's certain things that you can use, such as those mouse modifiers, where you can actually ignore the grid altogether. So if I hold shift and I do this, now I'm no longer being forced to do an eighth note, quarter note, half note. I'm going slowly across and I could go anywhere in between. Now that's shift for a mouse modifier. If you mess up, if you go too far, or if you want it to adhere to the grid, you can just click and drag back and it'll start adhering to the grid. So that shift basically temporarily removes the snap to grid on how far out you extend that note. So that's useful in many cases. In the beginning, you're probably going to want to stick to the grid, but just keep that in mind. Now to copy a note, you can hold the command key or control key. So you can hold the command key or you can hold the control key on the PC, and that will make an exact copy of the note. So if this note was twice as long, and I hold the command key, then we have a quarter note here as well, or note the length of a quarter note. So that's very useful too, because if I have chords, instead of me drawing out every single note of every chord as I go, that can get pretty tedious. That's not the best use of our time. The idea is to work swiftly so that we can focus on the music. Then I can take this chord and I can select it, I can hold command and I can copy it. Right, so I hold command, I can copy the entire chord, and then I can just shift around whatever notes need to move as necessary. So that's very useful to be able to manipulate not just one note, not just copy one note, but manipulating and copying multiple notes. And I didn't mention this before, but there's a few obvious commands that you want to keep in mind for this type of software or any software. So there's Command C or Control C, which is copy. So you can do the same thing here, copying notes with that. And there's Command V or Control V for pasting. So this is the same thing as if you were using Microsoft Word, for example. And then there's Command S, which is a very smart idea to use on a regular basis. Even if you have auto backups, applied, where Command or Control S is to save your project. So it's always a good idea to save the project. Command A will select everything. That's for all, or Control A. And again, these are all relatively universal across numerous software applications, not just DAWs, not just music applications. And when I say DAW, I mean Digital Audio Workstation. For anybody that doesn't understand, that's basically the software that we use to record music into. And then we also have the transport controls, which you'll see on the main window, right? Play, stop, record, stuff like that. So to play and stop is the space bar. So you saw me play these notes a little bit, so I press the space bar, and then to stop it, I would press the space bar again. You can actually have the default action of it revert to where the playhead is. So this is my playhead. So if I press play and I let it play out to here, and then I press play again, it'll stop and it'll put the playhead back here. So the next time I press play, it'll play from the beginning again. Okay, and one last thing I want to talk about is to remove notes. So if you made a mistake or you don't like what you're hearing and you want to try something different, you can click the note and click delete, or you can hold the Alt or Option key and swipe the eraser over it, and that will erase the note. Okay, and then if you want to see what notes are playing on a specific key, you can just click that key and it will highlight that row, so just so you can see that things match up or see where things match up. So if I was expecting this to be a C triad and this to be a C triad, but I accidentally put this note down here, I can just click and drag it back into place, and now everything looks good. So that's also very useful. Okay, we talked about adding notes, and we talked about extending their length, but there's other things that you can do with MIDI notes as well. So if we zoom in a little bit, you can actually split the notes. So if I have a note that I put here, and I have it be this long, I can actually select right here and hit the S key that we talked about earlier to split. And now we have essentially two different MIDI notes. Okay, so this can be useful because you might want to shorten things and you might want to delete the excess. Okay, so instead of clicking and dragging the end, you could just split. Or you might want to split a note and move something out. Okay, put a little bit of gap in between, especially if you're trying something different at some kind of transition. Okay, so splitting is very useful, not just in the MIDI editor, but also in the arrange view. The arrange view being where we created our tracks to begin with. If we're moving notes around, you can click and drag the note and move it all over the place. Okay, but if you want to make sure that that note only moves in a specific direction, like left and right or up and down, then you can hold Command and Shift on a Mac, and I believe on a PC it's Control Shift. But if I hold Command Shift and I go left and right, if I start going left and right, it will not allow me to go up and down. So I'm trying to go up and down here, but it will only let me go left and right because the first movement that I did was left and right. Same thing goes for up and down. So if I hold Command Shift again and I start going up and down first, it'll let me go up and down, but it won't let me go left and right. As a beginner, you might not understand why this would be useful, but the amount of times that I've tried to move notes just up and down without them sliding across in the MIDI editor, I can't even count. So just keep that tip in mind for when you start moving things around, when you start adjusting chords, right? Moving different pieces of chords, different notes of chords, or duplicating notes from chords and bringing them lower, creating a bass line, bringing them higher and creating a melody. And you don't want them sliding left and right. That's a very useful key command. Again, Command Shift or Control Shift on a PC. Another thing I want to talk about is this right here, this special track list button. I believe this is not selected by default, so you're going to want to go ahead and select that if you want to see what I'm looking at, which is the track list. And this basically lists all of the tracks that have MIDI information on them. So I have a strings track that I have MIDI information, a synth track with MIDI information, and a piano track. The thing that I like about this is I like to work in my MIDI editor in basically full screen mode or just about full screen. I don't want to go down here and while I'm recording this, mute these tracks manually in the arrange view behind this editor. And I don't want to necessarily force this editor to be exactly side by side or on top or below. I just want to work on this editor 100% looking at the MIDI notes. But if I want to manipulate those other tracks, like the mutes or the solos, or I want to go between the tracks and I want to select which one is going to get recorded onto, I could do that straight from just having this track list here. Now this might be something that's a given in Pro Tools, but it's very useful to see in Reaper. It's just not a default, so make sure you turn that on if you want to be able to mute the other tracks as you're recording, or unmute them, or solo them, or whatever you need to do so that you can record the track that you're working with. Now before we go out of the MIDI editor, I want to talk a little bit about a few additional view options that you have. So in the view menu, we have this by default as the piano roll, so it's showing the piano. But if you want to look at the named notes, so these are the 0 through 127, that has to do with MIDI. Slight geek alert, but it's 0 to 127, basically 128 different notes. That's because MIDI information is stored in 7-bit bytes, which are essentially 2 to the 7th, so 2 to the 7th being 128. If that just flew over your head, don't worry about it at all. But that's why MIDI notes go from 0 to 127. It's the same reason that the velocity on a note goes from 0 to 127 as well. So if I click and drag this down, go all the way to 0. If I click and drag it all the way up, the max is 127. So a little bit of trivia. So you can look at the named notes, and this is useful if you have certain virtual instruments, like your drums, for example, mapped to different notes on a pad. Some kind of MPC or pads, or you have different piano notes mapped to a specific range in your keyboard, right? And you don't know exactly where that range is, then this could be useful for that. I like to use the piano roll, even if I'm working with drums. Like I mentioned before, you could actually have the drum names listed on the keys. And then for those that like to use musical notation, you can actually select the musical notation. Now, I haven't vetted this. I don't use this a lot, but it's pretty cool how much it transcribes it into musical notation just by selecting that. And then another thing that I want to talk about from this is going down to color notes by. Let's get this back to piano roll. So in view, we go to color notes by. So they're colored by velocity. That's actually why they're starting out green, but you can actually color these notes in different ways. But one that I thought might be useful for some folks is coloring it by pitch. And this basically lets you see a different color for a different note. So all these yellows, they're all the same note, they're all the same pitch. All these different colors, they're on different pitches, but this is a good visualization, especially if you're trying to compare chords in one section of your MIDI track. Let's say we're all zoomed out, right? Chords in one section of MIDI track, or notes in one section of MIDI track with notes in another section. You can actually see where those notes land in relation to each other using the color. And then another thing I want to talk about, and it was plaguing me for the longest time. Let me get the color back to velocity. And you might notice here that I don't have the velocity handles on the notes, or the things that you can click and drag to change the velocity up here. I adjust the velocities down here. That was a huge pain for me. So let me put that back on real quick so you can see. You probably already have it by default. But if I go down to piano roll notes, show velocity handles, these lines are what I'm talking about. This little line that you see here, whenever I try to click and drag the note and I accidentally hover over the line, I'm actually adjusting the velocity instead. And the amount of times that I've done that, where I've changed the velocity when I didn't want to, and I didn't move the note, and I have to Command Z to undo, or Control Z on a PC to get back to where I was, and then click and drag again, or try multiple times and not to hit that line that adjusts the velocity, but actually click and drag the note. It's actually a big time waster for me, especially if you're working in a very small scale, right? It's just that much more easy to be moving the velocity around instead of the notes. So instead of doing that, what I do is go to View, Piano Roll Notes, and I'll uncheck the Show Velocity Handles on Notes. And now when I click and drag the note around and everything like that, I'm not touching the velocity, I'm just touching the note. And let me explain, velocity is essentially how hard that note is being hit. So it can be kind of in relation to volume, right? A lower velocity means that you're basically playing a note softer, and a higher velocity is playing the note harder. So you can kind of think of it as somebody that's just gently touching a piano key versus somebody that's hitting the piano key, all right? And the volume that would result from that. What I like to do is I like to just change my velocities here if I need to, right? In a lot of electronic music, if you don't really need a humanistic feel where everything seems like it was manually played by a human, if you just want to have the notes playing, the chords playing, and everything kind of all being hit at the same velocity, then you can just drag this all down to 0 and then drag it back up to some level, or you can drag it all the way up and drag it back down. And you can see that these are all now at the exact same velocity. So they'll all be played with the same amount of intensity as I play through the song. Now, we talked a lot about the MIDI editor and its usefulness, but many of the things also apply here in the arrange view. So we have a bunch of MIDI items here, and each one of these things is considered a MIDI item, right? Like we created this one earlier in the video. And you can do a lot of the same things that you can do in the MIDI editor with these items, right? You can hold shift and you can copy the MIDI items, okay, just like you did in the editor. You can go to the edges of the MIDI items and you can drag them out or drag them in. So if I only want half of this MIDI item, I'll just click and drag in. Or if I only want half of this MIDI item, click and drag it in to wherever I need it to be. You can use that shift key to basically ignore the snap here as well. All right, so this is no longer adhering to the grid lines because I'm holding the shift key. Right, and that's equivalent to basically clicking this box, right? The snap to grid. So with it disabled, it's doing the same thing, but I don't want to turn this off. I want to keep the grid on at all times so that the default is adhering to the grid, and then I'm using that shift key just in minor instances where I don't need to adhere to the grid. When you're recording, right, you don't need to create a MIDI item. You just need to have the track record armed and then click the record button, and it'll start recording. If I was playing, you'd see the MIDI notes here. But then it creates that MIDI item automatically. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about is recording on top of an already existing recording. So if I have these chords here and I want to play a melody on top of it, or I want to play a bass line underneath it, under the same MIDI item or on the same track, then I want to make sure that I click this in button and we do record MIDI overdub / replace and do record MIDI overdub. And this will allow me to record on top of what I already have here and not wipe anything out. If I didn't have this option selected, right, if I had record MIDI replace, then anything new that I record is going to replace the existing MIDI that I already have. Okay, so those are two important things. So when you're tracking something down for the first time, you might want to use the replace, right, because you record it, all right, you might have messed up, re-record it, record over what you've already done. Keep doing that until you get something solid. But once you have something solid that you're happy with, then you want to take that and you might want to put something on top or something underneath. That's when it's useful to put the overdub on. Now, speaking of layering, you can actually create other tracks and use the MIDI information that you have with different virtual instruments. So I could essentially take the chords that I have for the synth and copy them down to the piano, and now I have both instruments playing the same notes. Now that's because we didn't record any audio onto this track. It's just MIDI information, and that MIDI information is only going through the virtual instrument that you selected on your effects track. Okay, so this one will be going through the synth that I have on this effects, and this one will be going through the piano that I have on this effects. On top of that, you can also take pieces of it. So if I just wanted a bass line, right, I could go into this MIDI editor, right, into this MIDI item, and I could select the bass notes using that marquee select, right? Just the lower notes. All right, so I'll select those and then the ones in between. I can copy those and then I can create a MIDI item here, right? Insert new MIDI item, double click and Command V and paste them. So I copied with Command C, I pasted with Command V. On PC, Control C, Control V. And then I would put on a bass instrument here. So I'd pick some type of synth or I'd pick some type of bass virtual instrument. I'd put that here and then I'd have a bass line playing on top of my piano and synth chords. Because you don't have to draw out the notes for different instrument chords if they're going to be the same chords as other instruments. And you don't have to draw the notes for certain bass lines or melodies if they're going to mimic or closely mimic other instruments or other parts of the song, like the synth chords or the piano chords. Okay, so we got through the bulk of the video. We had those 10 tips that we were talking about, but yes, we go up to 11. So we're going to talk about bonus tips, and a couple bonus tips I want to talk about. We kind of touched on it at the very end of the last tip, but that's the dry method, and that's dry as in don't repeat yourself. Now with engineering and programming, there's this method where you want to make sure that you're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time you code. For software, for example, we want to apply the same thing to music production. if we know that our bass line is going to very closely follow another instrument, copy the bass line from that instrument and then make tweaks as necessary. This is what using MIDI is all about in today's in-the-box age. If two parts like the synths and the pianos are playing the same or similar notes, then copy it down to the other track as well, and then make fine adjustments from there. You don't need to be drawing in MIDI notes everywhere you go, one by one. Don't do that. Don't repeat yourself, as it says in the name. Now, another thing I want to talk about is saving templates. So if you've created a bunch of tracks, especially with virtual instruments, and you have your instruments on there, you have your inputs, maybe some other parameters that you have selected, you've got different panning, whatever it is you want, then you want to save that as a template. Then you'll go to File, Project Templates, Save Project as Template, so that the next time you go to create another project that's going to use similar virtual instruments and similar tracks, similar parameters that you've selected, you just go to File, Project Templates, and select the template. Or when you open a new Reaper session, you can say Create New from Template, and you select the template there. Okay, that'll save you tons of time as well. I hope you got a lot of value out of this video. I hope that it inspires you to want to go and create new tracks and new songs and just really pull up that editor, play around with things, play around with the mouse modifiers, the actions, set your own, create your own defaults, and see just how quickly, if you just put a little bit of time into learning the key commands, or the actions I should say, just see how quickly that you can go creating music, creating chords, creating melodies, creating drum progressions, creating all these things, moving notes around, copying, splicing, dicing. Let me know in the comments below what helped you, what you'd like to see more of. If this helped you out, definitely share it with your friends, hit the like button. If you want to see more videos like this, be sure to subscribe. As always, thanks again for joining the Ultimate Mixdown, and I'll see you in the next one.